Welcome to the 6th episode in a Legendarium series about the life and reign of King Edward III of England. In Part 6, Death Takes the Throne, we will talk about the glorious heyday of Edward III and how it was smashed by the greatest catastrophe in human history. On August 26th, 1346, King Edward III won his greatest victory at Crecy. With 12,000 troops fighting 25,000 French, his English and Welsh archers and cannon shooters slaughtered 14,000 French while losing only 300 of their own. The flower of French nobility perished in a morass of blood, including the King of Bohemia, the Count of Blois, and the Count of Flanders. His son, the Black Prince, at his side, King Edward III then laid siege to the French port of Calais. Almost 26,000 men fought in the siege, and it involved the largest English army seen during the 100 Years' War. After a year, the townsfolk grew so desperate that they began to chew the leather from their saddles. Finally, a deputation of townsmen walked out of the gates wearing sackcloth, barefoot, and nooses draped around their necks. It meant they would be willing to die if Edward would spare their city. After making a choreographed show of deliberation, King Edward III allowed his wife Queen Philippa to talk him into sparing the lives of Calais' leading men and their city. Calais remained in English hands until the reign of Bloody Mary 2 centuries later. King Philip VI of France cleverly called upon his Scottish allies to invade North England and force Edward to withdraw from France. King David II of Scotland obliged and led his army to Durham, rampaging across Northumberland. Upon arriving at Durham, David II demanded 1,000 silver coins in exchange for sparing the city. In the king's absence, William Le Zouch, Archbishop of York, confronted the Scots outside the gates of Durham. The Scots only discovered the presence of the English army on the morning of October 17th, when they stumbled upon them in the morning mist. With the English holding better ground, the invaders found themselves hampered by uneven terrain, and their formations fell apart as they tried to advance towards the English. Sensing defeat, many Scottish nobles abandoned King David II and his bodyguard to face the enemy alone. In the end, the Archbishop's troops found David II hiding under a bridge, and he became a prisoner in the Tower of London. With Scotland defeated, King Philip of France agreed to a year-long truce, and Edward III went home to England. During Christmas 1347, high-born revelers paraded about dressed as rabbits, dragons, swans, and pheasants, while the king and his knights dressed in green robes and peacock feathers. After Christmas, King Edward III organized a new round of tournaments, romantic plays, and games. At one event, he dressed as a giant bird. At another, he dressed his team in blue and white uniforms. Everywhere, he paraded the captive King David II of Scotland and many French lords made prisoners at Crecy around in fine clothes and made them attend his feasts. By then, he and Queen Philippa had 9 children. They ranged in age from Prince Edward, 18 years old and already a war hero, to William of Windsor, a babe in arms. He also arranged to marry his oldest daughter, Joan, then 15 years old, to Prince Pedro, son of King Alfonso XI of Castile. Joan left Portsmouth with 4 heavily armed ships to carry her attendants and possessions, including a wedding dress with a gown made from 450 feet of thick silk, woven with golden thread. First, Joan arrived at Bordeaux, where the mayor greeted her with a dire warning. Though Edward III won crushing victories, monkish chroniclers later wrote of terrible omens to the east. They wrote of fire raining from the sky in China, and great swarms of serpents and toads entering houses and devouring the inhabitants alive. That is likely fancy, but a terrible illness did indeed blaze through Cyprus, Sicily, and the Holy Land. The Black Death caused buboes under the victims' arms, causing them to lurch about. If they grew on the neck, it forced the head into a permanently crooked position. Dark blotches, called God's tokens, spread across the body, along with a hacking cough that caused incessant vomiting. Worst of all, the victims had to endure the stench of their own flesh rotting away as they died. Rumors spread that the disease could be caught by the smell of rotting flesh, by looking at a victim, or even thinking of the illness. People became so terror-stricken that they fled their own dying relations. Pitiful stories told of plague victims crying out for relatives who long since abandoned them. Princess Joan's royal party, perhaps intoxicated by endless English victories that appeared to show God's favor, ignored the mayor's warnings. In mid-August, a party member named Andrew Ulford, a veteran of Crecy, became the first to contract this terrible illness. As he gave off a foul stench, he began soiling himself constantly and lost his mind, wandering around screaming until he collapsed. Other members of the royal party quickly succumbed. On September 2nd, Princess Joan herself died from the illness. At age 15, she died a bloody, stinking death. Word of Joan's death reached her father about the same time that the Black Death began to ravage England's southern counties. Soon after, his baby son, William of Windsor, died at 3 months old. The infant received a full state funeral, something never given to Joan, whose body likely vanished in the plague pits of Bordeaux. Heartbroken by the loss of 2 children in a month, the royal family had little time to grieve. Barons and beggars alike bled and vomited to death in the streets. Henry Knighton wrote that there was no memory of death so stern and cruel since the time of Vortigern, king of the Britons, in whose day the living did not suffice to bury the dead. Though a rural country, England was densely populated, with single huts housing entire families who slept on a single straw mattress or bed with animals nearby. Many communities lost anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 their populations. People flocked into churches, praying for a cure. Churchmen and doctors who tried to tend the plague-stricken often followed them into the grave. Scholars frantically tried to cure the illness with increasingly bizarre cures, like strapping chickens to swollen necks so they would absorb bad magic. Others, in the belief that the plague traveled on the wind, took to living in sewers to protect themselves. Of course, they only died of other ailments. Scholars speculated on the cause of the plague and came to believe that God unleashed death through a mystical planetary alignment. However it arrived, death had come to Edward's glory. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.